So we're just going to jump right in. Lots of biographical style questions. And of course,
David Bentley Hart, as many people say, writes like no other person. I've never seen someone who writes like him. He wants to make you go and get a thesaurus, right? To improve your vocabulary. That's exactly what he did for me and some of my other friends.
There are folks who just kind of prophetically stand out and say things that nobody else kind of has the guts to say, confront things in very, very forceful ways. And he does that over and over again.
I think there's probably no theologian contemporary that has influenced me more. I have literally read everything he's published, I think. If I haven't, I would be surprised. I appreciate his intellect, his orthodox foundation, and I like his vocabulary and his wit, and even at times I like his snark, which he's kind of famous for, that I find winsome. But I just think he's a tremendous thinker who is not just a theologian. I mean, he also is, an accomplished scholar in philosophy and some other disciplines.
He knows about languages, ancient cultures, philosophy, religion, theology. I mean, usually academics in this day and age sort of have a lane and they stay in that lane. They don't usually, if I was to make the baseball comparison, Ohtani in baseball now, you don't ever get somebody that hits, and plays the field and pitches. That just doesn't happen. So usually you don't get a scholar who's able to comment on such a wide range of topics.
He's a really original character. I appreciate an American who tells the truth and isn't naive and sentimental and is endlessly ironic, which seems to me probably an important way to be if you're living in the US. But of course that means that most people there think he must be very nasty, or quite a lot of people do, and they don't realize he's one of the few very good people who live there. He's like a walking encyclopedia, that he knows more than even the most advanced computer. So you could ask him about anything and he'll know, I think he may have been here since the beginning of creation, probably. One doesn't like to speculate, but maybe he's descended from the giants and, the fusion of the Watchers with the daughters of men or something like that. I think that seems quite plausible.
I think that what I appreciate the most about David Bentley Hart is his sense of humor. Quite often, my wife Wendy and I will read either in one of his books, or we've really enjoyed reading his New Testament, new translation of the New Testament, and some of his notations or some of the things he writes. I mean, we'll just bust out laughing. And so I don't even know, I think most people, when they think of him, unless they're familiar with his work, probably don't think of him as like, oh, he's really funny. But he really is. And I wonder if sometimes it kind of, it's masked a little bit maybe by some of his language or the way he, but I think if you can really catch on to his sense of humor, you'll appreciate him and his writing a whole lot more.
I think David has an energy about Christianity that you don't find in, I think he has a passion, I think is the right word. He's passionate about God. And so sometimes, that passion can get edgy, and I think most of that is love. I think sometimes people think he can be a little sharp sometimes, but I think it's motivated by charity, So I really like him a lot. Yeah.
As a child, I had all sorts of interests in natural sciences, but I chose, I remember vividly that at the age of 8 or 9, I had already resolved that I wanted to be a writer. I had very little interest in things ecclesial or even Christian things in general, but I came from an observant family, if you can call high Episcopalians observant, and I came to love the old liturgy before the reforms in the Episcopal Prayer Book of 1979, Cranmer's English, and the Coverdale Psalter were part of an early education in the beauty of the English language. The rest held very little appeal for me, I mean, the children's books I learned to love fairly early were The Wind in the Willows and the Alice books, Winnie the Pooh, that sort of thing. But I moved on fairly quickly. It was a bookish family, and so I was reading, I think, Robert Louis Stevenson, who's good at every age, as a boy, and countless other things. I became interested in Asian, Chinese and Indian myth and legend fairly early in life, which actually was the beginning of my interest in religious questions. Curious to say, it was an interest in Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism that drew me back ultimately to an interest in Christianity. So in a rather peculiar sense, I came to Christianity through an Eastern door.
I could not picture him basically trying to be a businessman or a politician or just having a job somewhere. No, his mind was always very inquisitive. He was always learning, he was always studying, he was always absorbing ideas, and so the fact that he would grow into the scholar that he is I don't think there's anything else he could have done.
David and I are 9 years apart, and so growing up with him was quite different than growing up with Bob. Bob and I were almost exact contemporaries, 2 years difference. And Ben, it was much, or David as you call him, we call him Ben, was a much greater gap between me and between him and me, and so growing up with him when he was quite young, I read books to him. I remember I bought him all the Oz books, for example, and read through them with him. So a lot of the things that he has come to enjoy later in life were books I think I may have introduced him to. I mean, for example, as great as some of the church fathers and all of that are, I think probably he would have to put Alice in Wonderland at the top of his list of books that he has a deep affection for, and I know I instilled that into him. So I read to him, and we had a older brother, very much younger brother, and then as time went on, of course, I went in my direction as a person almost a decade older into college and things of that nature. He was very young, and I would say we reconnected in college, because I remember I was teaching a course at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County in 1982 on contemplative traditions in the various faiths, and I was asked to teach a course, which was quite an honor, and he was actually in that class. He took that course, and so yeah, we connected on that, and I think our interests have always dovetailed. I mean, his approach to things. It's funny when you look at brothers. Bob is different than both of us, but David and I very much think in the same way, and pretty much if you were to do a, say, Myers-Briggs, we come out identical in that way. So there's that tendency we both have to think along certain currents, and Bob thinks sometimes along a different current, but it's wonderfully complementary. So he sort of got all the good aspects that Ben and I missed.
In a strange sense, because my brothers are older than I am, I think this is a common experience for the youngest child in the family. Some of their memories are somehow my memories too. I was born in 1965, so I suppose that would make me really a child of the 1970s. But I feel much more like a child of the 1960s because so much of my sensibility was formed by constant interaction with my older siblings. Now, if I were the oldest in my family, that wouldn't be the case. And others, I have friends who are my age, but who are the oldest, and they don't have that same association. So in a sense, Addison, Bob, both of them, are part of, they're somewhere down there at the foundations of my personality, my sensibility. I mean, I'm very unlike them too in other ways. But, their influence on me was the influence of older brothers, older by a significant number of years.
He was always inviting a challenge, even when it was not to his best interests. So he, at one stage when he was about 9, I shouldn't even tell this story, but I will. When he was about 9, he began to boast to me and my best friend, who's now dead, sad to say. But he was about 19, I was about 18, and David was 9. And he decided that he was an escape artist and that he could escape from any situations, Houdini-like, that he could escape from it. And we kind of looked at each other at 18 and 19, and he was boasting about this ability that he had to get out of knots and enclosed spaces. And we just went, okay. And we tied him up with a rope and put him in a dark closet and left him there. And after a while, he was, guys, this isn't funny. This isn't funny, guys. And you hear this thump, thump, thump on the door. And eventually we had to let him loose. But whether it taught him humility or did some kind of deep psychological wounding, I can't say. But that I remember, but that doesn't tell you anything about his later abilities, except the pugnacious spirit with which he got himself into so much trouble. That might say something.
Our father and mother didn't really burden us with particular expectations. My father was in the business world because when he really should have gone into opera. He had an operatic bass baritone. But that wasn't really as profitable as, say, being a tenor. And he had come back from the Second World War after fighting through some of the most monstrously violent campaigns in the European theater. He was part of the 100th, but he fought his way through the Vosges Mountains and lost lots of friends. And when he came back, like many in that generation, he simply wanted to have a family and pretend, in a sense, that the things that had happened to him were in the past. They never were. In those days, they didn't speak of post-traumatic stress syndrome, but it definitely, that generation, he and my uncle Robert, who was in equally violent fighting in these, he was at Iwo Jima, for instance, never really got over those days. So my father went into business in order to support a family, but he hated it. And so he never actually made any effort to encourage any of us to undertake a responsible course in life. He never once suggested we should go into business. It was always So, I mean, from early on, it was obvious that my interest was writing. That was fine with him. He had no. So it's hard to say. I don't know what they expected of us or what we expected of one another. It was a sort of kind of wonderfully undefined reality. And on my mother's side, there were definite streaks of bohemianism. I had an artist uncle and, who was younger than she and very much part of the 60s counterculture and things of that sort. So it's hard to say if there were expectations. And there was a wonderful sense of liberty in that. It was a world almost entirely free of pragmatic concerns. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but I'm also saying it's not a bad thing. It's just the case that was not how they thought, and it's not how we were ever taught to think. There was in my family, I suppose you would call it Anglophilia, but that's misleading because it wasn't a sort of affected fascination with a foreign country. It's just that all our forebears had been British except for one stream of French on my mother's side. We were East Coast people, and so our culture was always transatlantic. The books we read, the music we listened to, the films we watched, even the television we watched was predominantly British, and so we sort of lived in that East Coast transatlantic milieu and had very little sense of America. In fact, I haven't got a trace of patriotism in me, and I don't think they do either. I don't know. Not because they hate America, it's just that we never thought in terms of America. We thought in terms of Maryland. It was sort of this old British colonial mentality. We thought of Maryland. This is our homeland, and we thought of British culture as our natural as having some sort of natural affinity, or we had some natural affinity to it. So we share that world, and it's one that's unlike that of many of those we grew up among. So in a sense, there's a world of sensibility that we have in common that friends and acquaintances from outside that sort of environment couldn't quite understand, I don't think, or wouldn't quite recognize. We were very bad Americans, except for baseball. That's the one place where a throb of national sentiment is possible for me, and jazz.
I remember when he was about 7 or 8, and all the kids were running around in sneakers and shorts and very comfortable clothing in the summer. He would dress up and button all the way up to the neck and wear leather shoes, and then I would say, "Come on, kid, dress like the other kids and go out there, get dirty, have fun, roll around." But then I told him how to play baseball, and by that I mean even some of the tricks, like how to hold a bat with fingering the bat, put pressure points on it, things that professionals learned that I was aware of. And so watching his love for baseball develop was not a surprise at all either.
You know, I was a baseball fanatic from a childhood, and I played it well for my age at each level until, of course, one gets to the critical level when I realized that I would never, ever be able to hit a major league curveball. It's the perfect game. It's exquisite. I mean, it has a dramatic flow to it that when it's played well. It was luckily the rules committee in the off season helped restore the game to something more like what it was when I was a child, before it was discovered how much time you could waste and how many unwritten rules you could exploit to turn it into a boring game. now it's much more like the game I grew to love as a child. It has both speed and, has moments of great drama, moments of suspense. If you know what's going on the field, if you know just from watching the positioning of the players, you can follow the strategy unfolding on both sides of the ball. I love the idea of a sport that, on the one hand, first of all, I think bat and ball sports in general are superior to all the others. The others are all basic variations of the same banal game played on an oblong. You're trying to get an object from one end of the field to the other into a goal or an end zone, and you just set two gangs of thugs fighting over the territory in between. None of them, I think, is interesting as a game. They're all, depends on whether you like them as sports, as athletic spectacles. The baseball's interesting as a game because it's a game of strategy played on a board, in which the simple algorithm of either advancing the runners or preventing them from advancing can lead to an extraordinary complexity of both premeditated and unplanned events, and again, both defensive and offensive strategy. I like the fact that that the ball is always in the possession of the defensive team. That there isn't just this sort of melee, the sort of military clash of two massed forces, but instead there's a kind of syncopated rotation of offense and defense, and two very separate kinds of games being played against one another. And then there's the sheer beauty of it. For athletes, all the sports have great athletes, but for sheer grace and speed, for the combination of power and grace, there's nothing like what happens, say, in the infield when a beautiful double play is turned. To see, Ozzie Smith made plays at shortstop that were balletic in a way that nothing, and I mean nothing, that happens in those other games matches, even in basketball, which at least has flow and agility, but it's still a much more confined sort of game. And in the outfield too. I mean, there are forms of there are moments of just pure, unbelievable athletic skill that, in order to be performed properly, have to be done with, at the same time, consummate grace. And it's not played by clock. You really never know. I have seen games go into the ninth inning in which a team is down 8 runs and yet the team wins. It has moments of peripety in it, tragic, comic, in the way no other sport does. For the most part, now this isn't always true, but for the most part, say in an NFL game, at the beginning of the fourth quarter, if you don't know who's going to win, then it's an outlier, And then there's just a long history. It has a literary history. It has a cultural history. It harkens back to a better sensibility in sport, not necessarily in anything else in American history. It was more instrumental than any other sport in social advance. I mean, the breaking of the color barrier when baseball was the national obsession in the late 40s, 47 and 48, gives it let's say, a game. It has an honorable history as a game that redeemed itself from the evils of its culture, and in so doing helped redeem the culture to some degree. And it was the game that was, of course, most fun to play as a child. All the others, as I say, seemed boring by comparison. There was never as much going on. In a single at-bat, in a single pitch, with the positioning of the players, with the calculation of the pitch being thrown where, when, how, and if the batter try at this given moment in the count, there's more pure thought going into that one event than in an entire NFL season.
he always had signs of a keen intellect. I mean, I remember when he was 4 years old, taking apart the screen door bit by bit and then putting it back together again. So an uncommon mind for taking apart and putting together already at a very early age. And so I think we always knew he would, and he always did well in school and in college and things like that. So it, perhaps we couldn't have predicted that where he would end up would be in areas of philosophy and religion necessarily, or theology and metaphysics and all. But it's not that surprising, you know.
The Anglican tradition is strange because it's gone through different phases. There's been high and low church, Protestant, Catholic. I was raised in a fairly high milieu, more, I don't know if these words mean anything to you, more Laudian than Anglo-Catholic, than Oxford movement, but Anglo-Catholic. But the truth is that in the Anglican tradition, precisely because it always claimed for itself a sort of apostolic legitimacy, but did so not through what they considered the illegitimate claims of the papacy, at least they came to think is illegitimate. They created a great culture of patristic scholarship. In the 19th century, the center of patristic scholarship was England, not Germany, not Italy, not France. And really, when Cardinal Newman became Catholic, you know, he wasn't a cardinal at the time, he discovered a remarkably poor intellectual culture, very, very little historical knowledge, very little grasp of the patristic literature. I was raised with with this awareness of the Eastern Fathers and the Eastern tradition. So Eastern Christianity always seemed correct to me. And I think the liturgical changes in the Episcopal Church probably caused me to lose some interest in its style of worship. It was no longer using the beautiful Psalter I had grown up with. The other thing is, as I grew older and had a more sophisticated grasp of the historical traditions, I just realized that I was not a Western Christian, in the sense that all the dominant categories of the Augustinian heritage and of Western heritage I would consider wrong. The discourse of nature and grace I thought was unconvincing. The doctrine of inherited guilt, clearly I thought was false. Models of atonement. And the failure to emphasize something that was just front and center in the Eastern Fathers I'd been exposed to, which is the theology of deification, which it seemed to me was the only one that made sense of the larger Christian story. You say God became human in order that, ... and don't finish that sentence in a way that has a kind of a cogent explanatory power. It seems to me that all you're saying is that we were visited by an extraterrestrial, maybe, in order to get us off the hook for sins that we ourselves had never actually been responsible for to begin with. You know, it just seemed like an unimpressive story, whereas in the East there was this, it was simply central to the understanding of the gospel, that there was this miraculous exchange of natures in Christ, which was meant to be a universal truth for humanity, that the point of the incarnation was not a rescue effort enacted as plan B in order to square accounts with an angry God, but that rather it was the very purpose of creation, which was the union of God and creature in a deified humanity. That captured my imagination early on, maybe in part because of that, as I say, that early exposure to Asian religions. It was the only version of Christianity that seemed to me as impressive, say, as the Upanishads. And so I just I think, how old was I? I would probably have been 20, I think 21 when I became Orthodox. It just so happened that I got interested in certain aspects of late antique Christianity and the metaphysics at the time. Stuck with it, wrote a doctorate on a theological on a theological topic, which then became a book which sold well, and people began to know me for that, and that's what people wanted. And I needed to make a living, and so that's what I was writing about. But to this day, I regard theology as the least important topic among the things I write on, or least important to me, the one that has the least emotional significance, and in fact, it's not even one that I intend to continue doing much past next year. I've written 2 books with my son now. The first one, when he was 11, that was delightful because he was 11 and we were writing a book based on games we had played together with toys of his. We didn't publish it though until years later, so it was only published 3 or 4 years ago. And we've just finished the sequel, but now he's 23. And that's a completely different experience because now he's a full collaborator. He writes, some of the paragraphs are his prose, some are mine, and the 2 are all but indistinguishable, And that's delightful in a completely different way. It was fun with him when he was 11, because somehow he could infuse an 11-year-old sense of the silly into it. But I was in charge of putting it all together in synthetic form. But now it's collaborative in a different way. And our senses of humor are very similar, but they're not exactly the same. So we come up with ideas that the other one wouldn't have come up with. So, yeah, that's been, of all the things, obviously that's the most enjoyable, writing with my son. That we're going to do more if we can in future as well.
I think as a novelist myself, I very much like his style. I like his prose style. I'm a fan of his fiction work. He's written 2 delightful children's books, which I like very much. The most recent one, The Mystery of the Green Star, which is a story about his son's toys that his son had when he was young. He wrote it with his son, who's now an adult. And we share a love of children's literature. We're both fans of Lewis Carroll and Kenneth Grahame, the Alice books and Wind in the Willows. I love his short stories, which cover the kind of topics I'm most interested in and write about myself as a novelist. That is myth and time and the whole world of enchantment. I suppose the real bond I have with David is he's one of the very few modern Christians, modern theologians certainly, who believes in fairies. And that's really where we became friendly. I mean, I'd read his books and I'm an admirer of his theological books as well. And I, in fact, reviewed his translation of the New Testament for the Literary Review. So I came at him originally through his theological books. But where we really struck a chord was he has this extremely unusual in this day and age belief in sprites and fairies and other manifestations of the immaterial world that people children's literature and used to people serious adult literature and folktale until very recently. So I think if you ask me what is particular in my fondness for him, the man and the work, it's that. He not only believes in fairies, he thinks they should be part of the whole Christian worldview. He sees them as guardians and intermediaries between the material world, the human world, the natural world and the supernatural world, which of course he believes is all one anyway, and it's a continuum. He doesn't make division between the natural and the supernatural world. So he sees them as manifestations. And my first novel, the novel that brought me into the public consciousness, and was indeed my first novel, is called Miss Garnett's Angel, and it's about the Archangel Raphael and a particular 20th century woman's relationship with the Archangel Raphael. So, I mean, I too write about these sort of things, and my latest novel, The Gardener, also has fairies in it. So we have a kind of sympathetic bond through that. I, of course, tend to write about it from the point of view of fiction, but he's willing to put himself on the line and say they should be part of the whole Christian worldview.
What I think I appreciate most about David is this kind of, I want to say, a fundamental moral compass that's so stable and relentless and dependable that it's willing to be bold when it's called for, to call certain ideas or thoughts or theologies or perspectives or philosophies out that are reprehensible or heinous, or like as he put in some of his earliest work, right, in The Beauty of the Infinite, that are just ugly, bad taste, poor taste. And I think some people seem to be sort of they're kind of they act as if they're surprised at the course of David's development in his writings and the topics he treats. I don't think it's really that surprising if you realize that the through line is something like, it's something as simple as, surely God is as good as we've heard he is. And so whether you're, and also he's more wait, you could say other things there for David, like, the world's religions are more complicated than we've heard they are. God is a fundamentally more richer, more sophisticated concept than you might have heard. And, there you get sort of the early works against new atheists or something like that. They don't really understand what God is. They don't really have knowledge of the spiritual and religious traditions of the world. But I also think, if I can speculate a little bit, what drove David to oppose the new atheism is also that it's kind of this arrogant sort of almost nihilistic picture of the world. And so he's rebelling against that picture. Like, the world is actually more meaningful. There really is a sort of transcendent value to it. But the same thing, the same sort of compass is guiding him when he turns the critiques inward towards Christianity. I mean, that was already true in Doors of the Sea, where he critiques, certain Calvinist pictures or theodicies, right, explaining tragedies like the tsunami. And he's saying that's reprehensible too. We got to reject that. So you start to trace this. Well, what about when he gets to Universalism? And, okay, well, what's going on there? Well, he opens the book telling you, from his earliest childhood, he hears this story, and it's repulsive to him, like in his moral sensibility. And I think because David's so brilliant, he uses big words people don't understand, have to look up. He's so well read, he can reference all this different literature. He reads in these different languages, that it's too easy to kind of assume it's a kind of like arrogance or sort of a haughtiness on his part. But I think that's not the heart of it. The fundamental heart of it has always been this almost childlike, this is the paradox that might strike some people, almost childlike sense of goodness. And, like, why not? Why is this too good to be true? George MacDonald, again, to cite a common inspiration between us, said, it says in one passage, you say it's too good to be true. I say it's so good it has to be true. Even if we don't see how it is right now, but it needs to be somehow, right? And I think that kind of sense, that childlike protestation against anything less than a totally beautiful, right, early work, totally good and meaningful or true middle work with the new atheist apologetic steps, and totally good work on Universalism, New Testament, all that, anything less than that is going to seem to him not good enough to be true. That's the through line, and that's what he's influenced me on, I think, the most, is that sense of you can question and fundamentally reject otherwise very mainstream or well-accepted pictures or portraits of God, and it be an act of fidelity to the tradition, to the Christian tradition, to the faith, rather than an act of betrayal. And most people can only think in one or the other side, as usual. We're getting up to these false, abstract oppositions. Either it's like ideologically, you are either a Christian and you support the Christian tradition, the greater Christian tradition. So they liked him before because he was doing that in their eyes. He's fighting against the sort of external critiques of Christian, the cultured despisers, right, in the subtitle of his book. And so we like him now. We like him because he's protecting the heritage of Christianity and, I don't know, maybe Western civilization or something. But then he turns inward, and it turns out that his goal wasn't simply to be a sort of champion or a Knights Templar going on a crusade or defending against some incursion. It turns out that he really was all along a child asking of God, surely God is better than he seems. Surely he's more beautiful than he appears right now in these different philosophies or theologies or portraits of God or doctrines or teachings or scriptures, which, by the way, the early church fathers did routinely. This is not worthy of God. We need to seek a spiritual meaning. That's common. No matter what your other beliefs are, that was common. East and West on that. And so that's, I think, I got that sense from David early on, and that inspired me. And so that's one of the things I like most about him. It's one of the things that's most impressive and impactful to me, is a way of being fearlessly faithful that's not merely reactionary. A way of questioning that's actually a sign of faith. A way of protesting that's actually a deeper trust in who God is. It's what led me to kind of conclude that I always would tell my students that for me, maybe the first and perhaps one of the greatest theologians was Job. Because the whole time he's defending not just his innocence, but, and I think people miss this, he's also defending the innocence of God. God wouldn't do this to it. It's not I'm innocent, you shouldn't prosecute me. It's God wouldn't do this to an innocent person. So it's about God, not just about Job. And you get all the questioning, and you got his friends trying to defend him, or to defend God really against him. And then at the end, despite everything else God says, at the end, one of the things he says, if you notice, is Job alone has spoken truly of me. Well, most of what Job spoke was a protest against him. So I think David captures that sort of dynamic, and has from the start, and still does. And that strikes people variously as, they like it when it goes in their favor, and they don't whenever it goes against them. So I think that spirit of engaging, that sort of, it's not boldness for boldness' sake, or shocking just to be shocking. It's pushing the bounds, because surely faith is deeper than what we've heard. Surely God's better than what we've heard. So that's very inspiring.
David's The Doors of the Sea. That book changed my life. Just period. End of story. I was living in Chicago, working for Touchstone magazine. He had this article appear, and which was the beginning of that book, right? And I started interacting with him about that essay, and talking about the nature of God and these questions of suffering in light of the tsunami that he was doing there. And a man named Anthony Esselin, who was an editor at Touchstone, we had started this blog for Touchstone called Mere Comments. And it was something that was really cutting edge. I mean, back then, nobody was doing a lot with this type of thing. If you had a publication, you just had a publication. You weren't doing things on the internet. But I convinced the editors, let's do this back and forth. And so David and Anthony had this debate around this question. And some of that writing in his response to Anthony ended up, along with some other things he did, in that book. But reading that book was so helpful to me because I've always had the intuition that comes in the wisdom of Solomon, right? That God did not make death. That's what the wisdom of Solomon tells us. You know, that death entered the world because of human and demonic evil, and that God is in enmity with death. And that was so reassuring for me because I lost my father when I was 4 to Vietnam and the conflict there. And I've always had this sort of antagonistic, relationship with that. And an intuition that God is not a death dealer. Like Jesus says, the enemy comes to kill, to steal, and destroy, but I have come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. And that book is just again, a passionate, articulate, forceful message that God has entered into human reality in order to rescue us from death. The tears and the pain and the affliction of all of this, he takes those things away and only leaves us well and healed, and us and the creation. And it's short. Anybody can pick it up and read it. It takes a little bit of work to get through some of it, but it's a message that's very full of what the first Christians believed about God and the world and existence and suffering and death. That God enters into our experience of suffering and privation and of death in order to rescue his creation from impermanence. And I just think it's wonderful. I mean, it's a beautiful book.
He was an anonymous presence when I taught at Lancaster, when he had very long hair, and I think he mainly declaimed the great Northumbrian poet Basil Bunting in local pubs, and oddly we never really spoke. And then he was a graduate student and teacher when I was in UVA, and we started to speak a lot more, but we probably interact now more than ever before. And I think our views always resonated, but I think I've always been a universalist since the age of 8. I never thought that hell could possibly be permanent, but I think I've been influenced by David to see that as even more important than I once did, and perhaps the belief in eternal punishment as having distorted a lot of theology.
I remember the first time that I ever watched a David Bentley Hart interview. I think it was one of his lectures at Notre Dame. And first thing I want to notice, who is this guy? I had never heard anyone talk like he talked before, right? The Bible says how people were struck as Jesus talked as one with authority. That's kind of how I was with David Bentley Hart. So I was very drawn to David Bentley Hart from the get-go, from this video, because David Bentley Hart seemed to be somebody who was quite unlike my Baptist background, who said, you have these moral intuitions, but forget them, right? And so I went on to read as many books that David Bentley Hart wrote as was possible. One of the first books I read, of course, was That All Shall Be Saved. I remember I was in the Jerry Falwell Library. I was on the second floor. I remember the exact spot. I was sitting down, reading the book, and I started to pound my chair in agreement. Said, this guy gets it. This guy's awesome. I love that he didn't hold back, right? Because in many conversations that I have with people, I feel like, well, it's easier to catch flies with honey than it is with vinegar, so I have to play it nice. And he just revokes all those rules of combat. And I just love him for that. I think that we need somebody like that, because I think that it's important to recognize the power of our moral intuitions, which he does in that book, right? So I highly recommend people to go check out that book.
He's argued more strongly for universalism than I in the past have done, and I think he's probably right. This is not to say, one of the odd misrepresentations he gets subjected to, he's not saying there's no such thing as hell. It's just he's denying that hell is an eternal reality. It can't be an eternal reality. And I think I would, having put it like that, I think clearly he's right. The nature of the case, hell cannot be an eternal reality. Because the eternal is God, and nothing that is in God can at the same time be eternally separated from God, and that makes no sense at all. So hell is not eternal. Doesn't mean it's not unpleasant. We all know it's unpleasant because we all have intimations of what it's like to be at odds with oneself and the world and God, and to have no secure resting place. We know what that's like. We know what it's like to be overcome by feelings and passions that we find repellent. So we know it exists. We know this is one of the ways in which human creatures can be. But I think we can also know that it's not eternal. By definition, almost, it's not eternal because it's not of God.
I think the idea of hell as an eternal, harmful place of torment is a repulsive idea. It's absolutely repulsive, and I loathe it, and I think it's done enormous harm. And one of the great virtues of David Bentley Hart's theological work is his crusade, his vehement crusade to show that this was not part of the teachings of Jesus. I think it's done enormous harm, and I think it comes from a sadistic side of human nature, which I deplore, a controlling side of human nature, which I deplore. I think it's a taint on the Christian religion. I think it's done untold harm to countless children. And working as an analyst, I've worked, a large proportion of people who come into Jungian analysis have often been brought up in the Catholic tradition. I must say, usually by the time they come into analysis, they've abandoned at least a formal Catholicism. But most of them had retained the idea of hell. And most of them, however much they had abandoned all religion, not just Catholicism, but probably all religion, even though many of them would now describe themselves certainly as agnostic and possibly atheist, I would still detect the taint and grisly aftermath of the notion that you could be eternally damned. I cannot conceive. I'm a sort of fellow travelling Christian. I'm not a card-carrying Christian. But I do subscribe to the notion of a loving deity, and I certainly subscribe to what we know of what Jesus Christ taught and spoke about and believed in. And the idea that a loving God could commit any soul to eternal torment seems to me, well, first of all, I think it's irrational. It doesn't accord with anything we know about what he taught about his idea of God. And it's utterly repulsive.
The curious thing about the reaction to it is the way in which two different camps heard and experienced the book in radically different ways. Those people who thought that, who hated the book, thought that the rhetoric was fierce and polemical and aimed more or less at them, which I take actually to be a projection. I think they imagine something that's not there. There's strong language in the book, but it's actually it's always directed at a particular teaching, and the blame is spread around evenly among all of us for allowing ourselves. The other camp, the people who were either persuaded by the book or didn't need to be because they already agreed with it, heard it as a sort of passionate and tender, even. I had that, tender, and I've never had that happen before, in which a single book is experienced, I mean, just at the phenomenological level, is experienced as two different books by two different readerships. Now, the content of the book was offensive to some, I think, because they couldn't come up with a good answer to it, to be honest. Every single negative review, every attack on the book to this day has dealt not with the arguments made in the book, but with some other argument somewhat approximate to it, or that they expected to find there, or that they have supposed, or in the case of a particularly bizarre set of criticisms by a young Dominican recently, arguments against a set of suppositions about things I'd said in other books that he gets completely wrong, that have nothing to do with the argument of that book, but never once addressing the actual arguments of the book. So, I mean, the strange thing is, it's a book that excited passionate antagonism, and not a single cogent, not a single accurate denunciation, let alone critique. The things they denounced are what I was saying. That's strange. The other, though, is that it made me realize that for some people, the doctrine of eternal hell isn't just, it isn't, as I always assumed it was for most, a difficult and scandalous idea. It's actually a delicious idea. And it did make me think for a while that there are dimensions of the Christian psychology that Nietzsche got right. That at some level, a great many people who think of themselves as Christians have within them reserves of resentment and cruelty and sadism at the foundation of their faith, to a degree that I found shocking. Happily, they're not the majority. Nonetheless, I found there was an entirely different class of angry Christian. I mean, and the people angry at me for writing the book. And for them, it's not because they actually took delight in the teaching of hell. It was because they had reconciled their consciences to it at some point in the past, and then made themselves forget that they had made this deal with the devil, and didn't like it being brought up again, especially not in such what they took to be strident terms, because usually a book of universalism is going to be written on universalism is going to be written in an apologetic, hesitant, theatrically self-doubting voice, but I'm incapable of that to begin with. But also, I don't think there's any reason to be hesitant on this. I believe the traditional teaching is self-evidently perverted and cruel and stupid, and I don't believe it's warranted by the New Testament. It certainly isn't. In fact, I don't know any good New Testament scholar who actually believes that the later picture of hell that became fixed in the Christian imagination is to be found in the New Testament. Certainly everyone knows it's not there in Paul. Paul has no concept of it. But this group was sort of disturbing because I realized that there's a whole portion of the Christian world that, in a sense, suffers from a repressed memory syndrome. They made themselves accept something that they find horrific. They suppressed the memory, and having it dragged to the surface again, they found to be not only indiscreet, but somewhat obscene. And they were angry for that reason. What I have not come across is anyone capable of framing an intelligent or coherent argument for the idea of eternal hell. And I mean, I'm talking about even very intelligent people. Recently, here at Notre Dame, there's a thing called the Christian Life Journal, which isn't very good, but it's an online publication. And it published an article by Eleanor Stump in defense of the traditional doctrine. Now, she's an accomplished analytical Thomist. I'm not a great admirer of her work, but I don't think she's a fool. But this argument was so fatuous, it was frightening. Now, she was not engaging my book. I don't think she'd read my book because the arguments she made were all ones I dealt with. So if she had read the book, she would have made some effort to defend them against the critique that's already there. But the arguments she made were so bad that they defy ridicule. And yet she's not a fool. And I think of the three classes of my antagonists, that troubles me most of all. The people who are cruel and sadistic, nothing can be done for them. They will, leave them to the grace of God. The people who suffer from this trauma of their own conscience suppressed, they're a different case, and again, you leave them to the grace of God, try to reason with them. But otherwise, let them get on with their lives. But the people who have the brains to see the problem with what they're saying, but have somehow made themselves not see it out of just party loyalty, they're the people that frighten me most, because something tells me that in every despotic regime in history, those are the people who actually ran things. The ones who, not the lunatics, not the wounded, but the ones who had the intellectual resources to know better, but who had argued themselves out of it. Anyway, far and away the most controversial book I've written. There are people for whom it's just, if there's no eternal hell, what's the point, and bringing it up, arguing against it with any sort of vigor seemed for many people to be an offense against esprit de corps, I think.
That All Shall Be Saved. That book became very important on my blog. We featured it for months, and I'd invited a number of theologians to write reviews of it, and it, of course, became quite controversial. Throughout the academy, and also, of course, on the social media. David is he can be very blunt, ferocious in his criticisms. He is a fierce believer in universal salvation. And his book is necessary reading.
I would rather people be put off by what they take to be an overly ferocious style than that I be either boring or mealy-mouthed. As I said, I mentioned to you that certain readers of That All Shall Be Saved found its tone pugnacious and truculent and insulting, whereas others found it passionate and tender. It doesn't matter. It does matter how you approach these things. But my feeling is that what would have been worse than either would have been a dry, tepid, and timid expression of polite disagreement with the doctrine of eternal damnation, because I don't politely disagree with it. I regard it as a profoundly evil, psychotic, and sadistic lie whose principal purpose down the ages has been to terrify children into compliance with an institutional authority. It is a warped, degenerate, sickening belief, and it should be called warped, degenerate, and sickening. Any language milder than that would be moral cowardice.
David Bentley Hart. I first became acquainted with him through his book, That All Shall Be Saved. I appreciate the fact that somebody of his scholarship and stature would be very vocal about sharing the idea that God is going to redeem his entire creation. But more recently, I've been reading his New Testament translation, and this has just blown me away. It's not the kind of translation that you would read from the pulpit. It doesn't flow nicely in English, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't to make this great literary work, but his idea was rather to really get at the original intent of the writers and what God was trying to convey to us. So he tries to reproduce as carefully as possible the original language and meaning. And obviously there will be interpretation involved in any translation, but he really tries to be faithful to what was said here. And so sometimes that is very jarring, because if something in the original is awkward, he lets it be awkward in the translation. If something is obscure or confusing, he lets it be that way in the translation. If there are words that are confusing in meaning, he will take his best guess at it and then maybe put a footnote with other possibilities. And so as I read through this, I'm on my second time reading through it, and I keep seeing things, and it's not like when you read a familiar translation and you can just read along because you know what to expect. In his translation, there are surprises and there are things that are jarring, and you have to stop and think, what does this mean? Why did the author use that word? What does this expression try to convey? And so it's been a really good way to approach the New Testament again with fresh eyes to see more of the depth that is being related there.
Just with David, whenever I hear him speak, like maybe specifically about universal salvation, all I hear is pure sanity. Whether it be that all shall be saved, whether it be doors of the sea, whether it be the experience of God. Everything that I read from him, it just seems like it's resonating with me in a way that no other author has ever resonated with me, specifically in terms of religion. Genuinely, I think DBH has he has been a very key person in my coming out on the other side of my Christian faith being intact. And for the longest of times, the doors of the sea and that all shall be saved, those were the two big books that reassured me that I can be a Christian and still think and not have to close my mind and not have to turn off my brain. I'm greatly appreciative about the doors of the sea, that all shall be saved, because it's genuinely helped me stay Christian.
Well, he's incredibly well read, and we talk a lot about literature. He prefers to talk about literature than to talk about theology. I prefer to talk about theology, so we have a kind of personality clash there. But he's extremely well read, and I would say yes, he is certainly influenced by English literature. I'm going to say English literature because I'm thinking of the sort of deliberately the great English writers, but he's also influenced by the Scottish writers and indeed American writers. So I wouldn't, and indeed writers from many different French and Russian writers. I mean, he's got an amazing vocabulary. That's one of the things about him that's interesting. I sometimes spot him using a particularly esoteric word, and I know that he's just written that sentence in order to put in that particularly esoteric word. And sometimes even I don't know that word, which is quite unusual because my vocabulary is pretty wide as well.
I've never made any conscious effort to baffle anyone. The language I use in prose is the same language I use in speech. As I say, I come from a bookish background, so I've been told at times that certain words are obscure when I hadn't realized they were. Others I know to be obscure, but they're the correct words to use. My rule is if use precisely the word that most correctly means what I mean to say. I have no pity for those, though, who find it daunting. There's no excuse for complaining about such things. Pick up a damn dictionary, learn something. It's not up to a writer to curtail his or her language in order to cater to the presumed limitations of the readers. I prefer the American spellings when they're closer to the classical original, and there's some British spellings I think are superior for that. It's a quirk. I prefer the forms that come closer to the classical roots because I like seeing the Greek or the Latin through the transparency of the English. So I would never add a superfluous U to the end of labor or honor or any other word that in Latin doesn't have a U there. But I do like to preserve the diphthongs in words like aesthetic. I never, and I'm not that. No longer the American norm always to elide the first vowel. So no, but you've got to remember I've also been married to an English woman for over 30 years, so our accents and our habits, even the habits of spelling, tend to merge somewhere mid-Atlantic. Fiction can capture everything better than a non-fiction text. You simply have more modalities of expression. You've always got the option in fiction, of course, of waxing didactic and including exposition, but ideally you shouldn't need to do so. There are any number of ways of using suggestive imagery, character, any number of other things to make your point, and usually if you're trying just to make a point, you probably shouldn't be writing fiction. But yeah, there's no sense in which it is not a superior mode of writing. When you're writing on spiritual matters, you're trying to reduce them to propositions. So that already, in a sense, is an enervating experience. You're, in a sense, you're moving away from something ineffable into the realm of inadequate expression. Whereas in the realm of fiction, something else is happening. You're allowed to use suggestions, symbols, events, episodes, whatever it takes to give expression to something that doesn't need to be and doesn't want to be reduced to propositional prose. Somehow the description of a certain color of light in a window is important in a way that you're aware of without being able to reduce it to a formula. Why is it important that I pointed this detail? And sometimes you discover retroactively what your mind was thinking when you were not consciously aware of it. There's a story in the collection called, the collection is The Devil and Pierre Gernet. And the eponymous piece, or the piece that the collection is from the novella, is written in this very self-consciously mock late 19th century style for a reason. I'm imitating. But there's a story in there called the House of Apollo. And the structure of the story was perfect to me. It came to me all at once. I knew what was in it. It didn't require planning because it already seemed to have written itself before it arrived. And then after I wrote it, I realized what was going on in it at a deeper level than I had when writing it. Now, I have a friend, Ian McGilchrist, you may be aware of him. He would, the right side, my mind was using my right hemisphere more than my left. It knew what it was doing. I just hadn't informed me yet. Well, maybe that's true. I like to think in terms of inspiration as well, but I mean, there's a last scene in that story that I knew was the crucial moment in the story that reflects the scene of Moses in the cleft of the rock. Now, without that reflection, without that analogy, the story doesn't mean anything. And yet, I don't think at the conscious level I was thinking about that at all when I wrote it, but I was aware of having done it afterwards. So I think anyone who has the real joy of writing fiction, or can pull it off, I mean, I do think I can do it at an accomplished level, knows what I'm talking about. It's a richer, fuller experience. It makes you think you've lived to a purpose. Writing theology, to me that's simply putting ideas into forms that others can do with as they like. After I've written it, its fate doesn't matter to me as much. If you criticize a story I've written, then there's a problem. We're not going to be friends.
Kenagaya. It's one of the best fantasy novels I've ever read. It's amazing. It's a beautiful book, and I guess it makes you feel like even when things are very dark, that there is reason to have hope and reason to believe that even though the darkness seems so strong, there is still a light that the darkness cannot overtake. And as you might imagine, there's kind of a beautiful resolution to the end of the story. I don't want to give it all away, but it really makes you it's really a fun way of, it's one thing to sort of engage the analytical part of your mind. It's the other thing to sort of engage a story, kind of like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or something like that. It gave me that same type of feeling.
Roland became a pervasive presence in my writing simply because, as a rule, I prefer the company of animals to that of people. I'm just, I'm one of those unwholesome people who just is very private, but who loves animals. So my dogs and cats down the years I've always been very attached to. But Roland also is just an eccentric dog. He is a talking dog. I don't mean that he's quite as eloquent as the figure in my fiction, but he mimics human phrases with uncanny fidelity and uses them correctly. That is, he greets you with the phrase, "How are you?" for instance. And he has about a dozen to 18 such phrases that are quite distinct. So it was hard not to, and he's just an eccentric dog. He simply is. He has a way about him. Dogs are inexhaustible wellsprings of affection, and people who don't have them in their lives, I think, are unfortunate.
Well, I think what I liked about Roland was that's a book whose form, which allowed David to kind of speak to whatever he wanted to in all aspects of his, you might call it, general outlook on everything. Like so many of his other books, they're polemical in the classical sense of like there's a target, right? Or they're topical, like even and that all shall be saved is both. And that's often the clearest way to write. I like that, and David's a master at that. But Roland felt to me more expansive. It's not like there was one target or one view he was opposing or one thesis he was really trying to defend throughout the whole thing. There are probably, there are common threads, of course, and there are things we've all seen and heard from him before. But it felt much more at once personal. I remember telling him one of my favorite things is actually the way he introduces Roland. Like the way he describes him. It's so it's not just intimate, it's so well, I called it personalist to him, but it's very keyed to the uniqueness of every single person and spirit, and in this case, Roland. And it's in their relationship, and it's in the kind of back and forth, and the sage and bumbling interlocutor sort of genre that he gets to explore a whole host of things. And I think there you get one of the best, like in one volume, you get one of the best pictures of like David himself. It's like I stand by this. It's the childlike wonder. I'm interested in everything. I want to talk about Goethe for a while, and then I'm going to talk about the philosophy of mind and like panpsychism and what I don't or don't like about. Then I'm going to talk about bodhisattvas and it comes across not just as a smorgasbord of random things. It comes across like the stream of consciousness of an extremely brilliant child or precocious child that is just simply interested in, fascinated by many things, and things that both overlooked and also popular. And it's a kind of expansive spirit. And I think out of all of his books, that's the one that really captured that the most for me, at least.
I mean, Roland and Moonlight is an extraordinary book. The whole conception of the relationship between a man and his dog, with the dog being the superior intelligence, the dog teaching the human rather than the other way about, and the kinds of things that they discuss. I mean, Roland also believes in fairies. Roland also, like David, believes in dreams, also believes in a theophany, a world that is imbued with the spirit right the way up and right the way down. But it's also the humorousness of the dialogue, the wit, the repartee. And I mean, David is colossally intelligent, incredibly learned. But what he does in the book, he has himself as the person who is inferior to the superior intelligence of his dog, Roland.
A lot of people have commented, and I certainly had this experience. Roland and Moonlight is his most human feeling book. You really sort of get to sit down with him amid his suffering, in that book in multiple ways, which doesn't happen in a lot of his other writing. He's just smashing things to pieces in so many of his essays, and sometimes it's things I care a lot about, and it's like, I mean, dude, you're just merciless, you're just putting a wrestling hold on me, and there's no mercy. And but in this essay, in Roland and Moonlight, he talks about the death, of his own parents as they're living with him. His father and his mother are with him through this period, and both pass away, show up in the narrative quite a bit. His own illness, he recently mentioned in an interview in his trip to Australia that during this period that he writes quite a lot about in Roland and Moonlight, he was suicidal. He was, that messed up and hurting and, taken off track by his own illness and suffering and pain. And you get a sense this is a man who's suffered. But there's a lot of joy. It's an adult fairy tale, talking animals, literally fairies in it. His fictive uncle and his semi-fictive dog, whereas there's this very real story that's being told about a very real person that's easy to relate to. The fairy tale and fantasy is just kind of woven in, and it's in that in-between space. The title Roland and Moonlight, so it's all about that liminal space, between the night and the day, where things are, you're kind of in two worlds at the same time. So it's a beautiful book. It's long. Several people have said, gosh, why doesn't he let editors tear him apart a little bit more? But because I love it, I'm glad it's long.
As I wrote it, it became the book of everything. I could put myself into it entirely. I could explore themes. It corresponds to my sense of humor. I think it has some of my wittiest writing in it, some of my cleverest, which to me is important because I'm more interested often in the writing than in the content. But the content too, it allowed me, through the voice of this silly main character to explore all sorts of wild, speculative byways that I don't get a chance to talk about if I'm writing a text strictly of philosophy. I mean, I might advert to them, but I certainly couldn't explore them in the same way. And I think it has an emotional core to it that's surprisingly effective. I'll also say that it's a book that chronicles what was the darkest period of my life, and in a sense redeems that period for me. But definitely, I mean, that's the sort of writing I value most. Again, as I say, I try to make the theology and the philosophy more interesting than is normally the case. And I mean everything I write. I don't write anything simply to get words on the page to fulfill an obligation. I only write if I have something to say. So don't get the impression that I'm saying that I'm indifferent to what I... But at the end of the day, that aspect of my life is more just an accident of circumstance. The parts of my published work that actually come closest to who I am are the fiction and the literary and humorous essays in the collections, like A Splendid Wickedness, The Dream Child's Progress, and some of the essays in theological territories that don't really fit in one category or another. That's where I'm most at home, and before I die, where I'd like to spend most of the rest of my life. I'd like to be remembered more for the fiction and the essays on literary and other topics, if I'm remembered at all. I do worry that no one will be remembered at all, actually, in the years ahead, because I think literacy is in such sharp decline that we may actually be on the verge of its eclipse as a general attainment. I think that people will be able to read, I don't know, billboards and texts and tweets, but the ability actually to read continuous literature may actually be a capacity that's vanishing from the race the more we're integrated into the virtual world that we've created. I've seen again and again in recent years, just undergraduates, such a decline in attention span, such a decline in the ability to follow continuous arguments written out or to make them, that I actually think we're at a point of crisis. But if there are still people reading books 100 years hence, who actually know how to read, they might be small and exist in cloistered communities on the verges of civilization, I don't know. That's what I'd like to be remembered for, as a writer, and a writer of, as I say, fiction, of literature, and of humorous pieces. The theology, I think the truth about theology is when you write it, you try to express a certain vision of your faith. I have tried to make it cogent, try to give it a certain, make clear the metaphysical sympathies I have. But the problem is that theology, at the end of the day, is a discourse parasitic on a prior commitment to faith that, for most people, predetermines what they're willing or able to understand, or have sympathy for, or tolerance for. So you're always writing for a particular small faction within a small faction within a small faction, which may or may not bear fruit in the future. And in that sense, it's such an in-house exercise that it verges on solipsism at times. Whereas with literary work, you're creating a world of symbols, ideas, episodes that can float free of any particular context of interestedness and become and become a possession of people from all sorts of different backgrounds, all sorts of different systems of belief, and they can make what they will of it. And in that sense, you feel that you're doing something that has a larger and more beautiful range of possibility in it.